Sacred attention therapy is an approach to liberation. The first liberation is from the conditioned self, psychology of early life. The second liberation is from the realization of the true nature, the fulfillment of oneself as a personality. And the third liberation is the liberation into the life of spirituality and spiritual practice. Sacred attention therapy, or SAT, is a meta-psychology because it embraces not only the physical, emotional, mental and energetic aspects of the human being, but also the spiritual and the transcendental. Therefore, it is uniquely placed to be an applied psychology through counselling and psychotherapy in the 21st century, in which human beings are more complex than ever before.
Welcome to the fourth in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will discuss the lecture, Anger, the Destruction and the Disillusion of the Sacred, from the Novena Teachings lecture series. This lecture is available in written form in Moksha Dawn, an ebook you can order from the books page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. You can listen to the full recording of many of these lectures on the lectures page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. And lastly, you can view many other interviews on the videos page or on our YouTube channel. The URL, the web address for our website is www.sacredattentiontherapy.com. And on our website, you can click on the YouTube channel icon to view our YouTube channel. A little bit of background about Richard Harvey. He is a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and The Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Richard Harvey to the call. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you, Robert.
And a wonderful topic to explore, anger. And even the title of the lecture itself, the subtitle being The Destruction and the Disillusion of the Sacred, creates some interesting opportunities to explore. I wanted to begin, though, with a quote from you near the very beginning of the lecture, and you say, quote, "Anger is a way of seeking to control the world," end quote. And I wanted to ask, how does our anger translate into seeking to control the world?
Our anger is a reaction, I would suggest. It's a reaction to fear. And we're afraid when things are out of our control. We feel unsafe, we feel insecure, and our way of meeting that most often as human beings seems to be to try and control events, however futile, and however frustrating it is. And frustration, of course, is a form of anger itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So since the truth is that you and I are not in control, when we assume control or try to control, we're bound to be frustrated, and so we're bound to increase in our anger quotient.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, control is synonymous, more or less, with anger.
Mm. One of those emotional suppression examples that's prevalent in one of the core elements of sacred attention therapy, the emotional suppression. You mentioned that, and again a quote, resentment feeds the ego self. It is nourishment for the ego. Without it, the ego withers and dies. End quote. And I wanted to ask that if we transcend anger and resentment, have we also transcended the ego? Or does the ego still remain even if anger and resentment has been transcended?
The ego is dependent on anger and frustration and resentment for its nourishment. Therefore, the way I think I'd like to say it is that it's as long as it takes to starve, really. You know, you stop feeding it, and at that point, success is assured. But don't forget that anger, like doubt and negativity, not only in our way of talking about spiritual transformation, but for thousands of years, the teachings, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, are that doubt and states of negativity exist in very high echelons of spiritual transformation. It's almost as if to say it's absolutely necessary that that doubt and negativity be there to be transformed into not certainty but alignment with truth, you see.
Mm.
So when you withdraw nourishment from the ego, which is a nice way of working with ego processes and ego practices and the whole delusional body of the ego, you simply stop feeding it. It reminds us of that old American Indian First Nations story, I think, about the two wolves. I think I told it in Flight of Consciousness, and the son goes to the father and he says, I've got these two wolves, and one's friendly and one's angry and vicious and all this kind of thing. What should I do? And the father just points out, well, it depends which one you want to feed, and leaves it as a choice, really, for the child to decide. You can feed your anger, you can feed your gentleness, you can feed your fear, you can feed your love, you can feed your control, you can feed your surrender. So in answer to the question, withdraw nourishment for the delusional ego as a way of reducing its hold in your life. But always be humble about ego, because we know, I think, we should all bear in mind that it's an intention, it's a motivation, and it's a practice to, in any given moment, not fall prey to the ego's forces. But expunging the ego per se, that's a big one. It's going to be around in ever subtler forms for a very long time in all probability.
There's a very interesting passage where you suggest our anger may be inherited. And I want to read the quote. Anger, in truth, as any school teacher or exasperated parent will tell you, is admitting defeat. Anger always costs more than you expect and more than you get back. Anger and its family of emotions is both your own worst enemy and a gauge of our ego attachments. To make matters worse, usually it is not even yours originally. It was inherited. Now, in the context of that passage, there was a quote from the lecture. Where might our anger be inherited from? and what needs to be done to free ourselves from this inheritance, should we desire to do so.
Sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Our anger is inherited from the models of behavior of the significant carers in our early life. According to different stages of development, we will imbibe, if you will, the behaviors and the patterns that are in the ones who we look to with honor and respect, primarily because they're looking after our very life. So for most of us, this is mum and dad. Of course, it may be grandmother, grandfather, or a favoured uncle, or a nanny, somebody who's looking after us. But, mum and dad are the primary carers. And as they exhibit in their behaviour internal emotional states, so we replicate that kind of behaviour. I had a interesting discussion this morning where a gentleman was considering how come in a loving relationship he had very suddenly and quickly picked up a cup, a teacup, china cup, and very quickly, as he described, as if he were a karate master, it was so quick. He picked it up and he pitched it at the wall. This was in front of his loving partner. And I said, where have you ever seen that before? And it was no great surprise to find that it was his father. Though it took a few veils to get through, to return to the memory of being 7 years old and his father doing this, which is a shocking thing, for the child to witness. And yet it had gone in. No doubt that was a composite memory, and the father had done it perhaps many times. Who knows? It's rarely going to be once. And that pattern of behavior that expresses anger in the form of frustration, when we'll do something like that and just throw something really quickly, as if to dispel the hold of frustration. Of course it doesn't. It exacerbates it. We then take it on as a form of behavior. We all do, and unconsciously. We do. And you get older and you start to grow into your father, your mother, and all this, and you see and you feel them inside you. And the way to, as I worked with this man, was he had done enough therapy that I said the only way at this point is to offer it up in a bundle. We imaged the father, we imaged the connections, we bundled it up, and then I asked him to offer it up and say, take this from me. You can only do that if you've done some, detailed work along the way. But he'd done some detailed work along the way. This was a new memory, but it wasn't new material per se. Right. So we bundled it up and just offered it up, and you know what? It disappeared. And I said, you may have to do it again. I don't know, but for now, honor the fact that you offered it up and it was taken, as it were. So this is a very powerful imagery, and I'd, of course, encourage everybody to consider taking what in the end may be unknown. You don't even have to know it all, but image the father, image the mother, image your primary carers, all that you've taken in from them, all the behaviors and the attachments to those internal images of those figures. Dialogue, which is to say talking to them on paper or in your mind or both, and work through the memories and the anecdotes and the associations. Ultimately, you go, there's nothing else I can do, and you offer it up.
You intuited where my next question was, and I was going to ask you, so recognizing that this anger may be inherited, and again, speaking from the sacred attention therapy model, it presents itself through our family beliefs, through our life statements, through our emotional behavior patterns. I was going to ask, so how does one then give that up? And you shared a lot, and I'm so glad you did in that regard. There's a very interesting statement that you make after the material we just reviewed together. And this is the quote. Curiously, the deepest expression of anger is withdrawal. End quote. I'll read it again. Curiously, the deepest expression of anger is withdrawal. End quote. How and why is withdrawal an expression of anger?
I'm not going to give you anything. I mean, absolutely nothing. You know, not even my anger. I mean, you're so angry, you're not even going to be angry, and you're not going to share this in any way, because after all, in a sense, just to feel and express feel is a certain reaching toward the other, even when it's negative, even when it's violent. You know, there's a certain relationship, you might say there. But withdrawal is, I'm going to give you absolutely nothing. And you may have heard this story before, but there was this wonderful example. I was a youngish therapist. It was years ago in the 80s, and I was doing a bodywork group exercise. So you had 20, 30 people in this large room, and I'm leading breathing and stretching and reaching and whatnot, and getting people to get in touch with their emotions. You know, it was a kind of bodywork psychotherapy exercise. And this one guy is in a ball on the floor, and everything I'm saying he doesn't seem to be responding to at all. And everybody else is beginning to cry and beginning to make noises and sound like children or whatever. And there's all this demonstrative expression going on. This one fella's getting tighter and tighter and tighter over about 20 minutes. And finally, he exploded, and he just cried out, screamed, and completely obliterated all the other noise. He was so loud, and he just said, "I'm angry," in this liberating way. And as soon as he did it, he jumped up and down. He just ran around the room, jumping up and down in happiness and joy. He'd released the whole thing. He'd taken the withdrawal to the tightest ball possible. And then transformed it, gone straight through it. It's a dramatic example, should we say?
It is, and a very poignant one, and a very symbolic one as well. How, Richard, in your practice, when you're meeting one-on-one, face-to-face with someone, either in person or via Skype, what are the indicators to you that the withdrawal is coming to the fore, that the withdrawal is playing itself out?
Well, it would be expressed with being out of touch, perhaps with feelings or with events, or events in tandem with feelings. It would be a kind of what we call a sensitive withdrawn defense, or what used to be known as the schizoid defense, where the world is essentially so insecure and unsafe that you're not going to participate in it. So you listen for the clues in relationships and in world events whereby this person prefers to be on their own. You have a feeling you can't quite connect with other people. You sit and you have some kind of energetic exchange or feeling, but with somebody who is withdrawn in this way, you're not really touching them. They're not being touched energetically, emotionally, just in communication itself, let alone physically or anything like that. And you sense it and you feel it, and then in the narrative or in the sharing, you can see that feelings don't enhance or exist alongside relational dynamics or anything like this, and they won't use probably feeling language, that kind of terminology. So these are some of the things.
Would an avoidance of a response to a question also be an indication of a withdrawal? So, for example, you would ask an individual a question, maybe it's can you remember when that happened? Or what did it feel like when that happened? And there's an avoidance of responding to the question. Is that also a form of withdrawal?
Well, yes, I think it is, and we should perhaps also say denial.
Yes.
The possibility of denial there, and it also brings up another one. I think that's true what you said, which would also be avoidance of eye contact.
Right.
It's another one. This probably isn't an exhaustive list. It's a very interesting question. Yeah.
You go on to share what I think is a critically important point for the student of inner work, and I'll read another quote to you. Expression of feeling is not experience a feeling. Crying is not sadness, it is releasing sadness. A screaming tantrum is not experiencing anger, it is expressing anger. The psychospiritual organism is an incredibly wise, self-regulating, self-governing complex of healthy adaptation, so long as we get out of its way and trust and allow. End quote. What are the implications of this statement in regard to dealing with our anger?
Withdrawal was a good example. What I'm saying is that the experience of anger and holding anger inside and releasing them are different matters, and we have to learn, in particular with anger, a healthy and a safe and an acceptable way in which to experience catharsis. I mean, this is a very difficult one, but for example, in the couples workshops, relationships workshops that I've run over the years, I have a whole section about anger and handling anger in all its forms: depression, frustration, resentment, irritation, and all these things that are liable, unless we're so incredibly saintly, you know, however much you love someone else, you live with them, and things are gonna, right, there's gonna be some frisson there, and so there'll be irritation, and these things of course can escalate and so on. You must find a way in your life, certainly in your relationship, and in regard to emotional health, somewhere where you can be cathartic of emotional states with that, because if they're held inside you, then they will manifest, and that's the thing to realize. It's another thing I'll do in anger workshops, to say, where is the anger? What form is it taking? Chronic anger we're talking about, maybe built up over years, and maybe it's, you know, a tar barrel, maybe it's a fire, maybe it's a piece of metal, maybe, you know, various energetic depictions, shall we say, of what it's like. Then you've got to find a way to move that through. It's only turned into a tar barrel or something because it hasn't been moving through. So for all of us, there needs to be, while the emotional behavioral pattern of anger and potentially the storing of anger in the organism is still active, while that pattern is still in place and learnt and inherent from the past as a way of doing it, which is not healthy. One, how can we clear out the historical held anger, and two, how can we stop adding to it? They're two separate issues, you see. And so it's very difficult. I mean, for those people in therapy, of course, it's not so hard to know. I mean, the therapist and the therapy space should provide that opportunity, of course.
Almost towards the end of the lecture, you offer the quote, "You can decide never to be angry again," end quote. And I wanted to ask, is it really that simple? You know, can you simply decide to not be angry? And if we can decide not to be angry, does this suggest that when we are angry, we are deciding to be angry?
Well, when you're being angry, you are, you know, by implication, by default, you're probably ignorant of the patterns and the models and the developmental stages in which you learn these kinds of behaviors. So the first thing is, backtracking somewhat, is become aware. Where did you first experience anger? Where was it? What was your reaction to it? Was it a shock? Were you sad? Were you the recipient of anger with violence? And all of this, to really bring that up and to the fore. Then to work on the storehouse of anger inside you, as we said just now. And secondly, to stop adding to it, because obviously it's no good at all to clear out old historical anger that's stored in the body, because you learned that was what you should do with it. You should repress it. You should keep it in. But neither is it any good to work with that if you're filling it up in the present day, because the pattern is not been expunged. So when you see that pattern, you see it clearly and you work with the memories and anecdotes and your experience of it and how it's manifesting now, you can see it's pointless. It's as silly as trying to control the world. Ultimately, you and I don't have any control. There's certain things we can try and do in terms of going to bed at night and starting work in the morning and things like this that more or less we might be able to. Even those are hard sometimes, but we might be able to set some of those things. But I don't know when I'm going to have a message from the doctor that says I've got to spend days in the hospital, or I've got a year left, or whatever. I'm not in control of that. So I can't say I'll be sitting at my desk or in my therapy room next year or the year after. And neither can we say this for our loved ones who may be angry and frustrated about that, but the truth is we're not in control of any of it. And when you see that clearly, anger doesn't really have a role. It's only dissipating. It's rather like worry, which is arguably a form of anger anyway. Everybody knows there's no point in worrying. It's never enhanced anybody's life. And if you have a endeavor that you're involved in, you start worrying because maybe you'll fail or succeed or whatever your worry is about it, it's not going to help either. And yet somehow you can't stop worrying. So you must return to the root of worry. And sure enough, your father, your mother, or someone transmitted this kind of behavior to you, and your attachment to that person is meaning that you honor that relationship by continuing to worry. It's an example you live up to, so to speak. But when you see it clearly and you see through it, yes, you can stop and you can say, well, I'm not doing that anymore. And of course, then it's a matter of awareness, isn't it? You breathe, you're present, something happens to catch you. One last thought about this. When you get to that place, be prepared for regressive anger. Be prepared for very absurd small things and big reaction to it. Because that's the way it works. It gets incredibly absurd and increasingly ridiculous before you get to the point where you can say no. You have to go through a certain process of humiliation almost. Which you accept gladly, of course.
We've flowed through some wonderful material here. Again, as a reminder to people, this is available in the ebook Moksha. And when we come together the next time to continue the Novena teaching series, the lecture we'll be discussing is now. Enlightenment has always been. Look forward to it, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Till next time.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.